Okay. Yes, now I'm ready.
No, this one right.
Maybe not. Okay, now I'm ready. All right, for the cameras. Hello, everyone. I'm Duncan Iaria. I'm an interface engineer here at SOLTECH. And today, I'm going to be presenting to you all React Native and the Create React Native app. So, just to kind of let you guys know how I approach this presentation and some of my goals for it. It's going to be sort of a high-level presentation. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of necessarily making stuff with React Native today, just because that's a whole rabbit hole. Instead, I'm going to just kind of show you guys. I've got two goals. One is for the to kind of show React Native to the architects here at SOLTECH, to kind of let them know that this is out there and it exists, and hopefully we can add it to our tool belt here at SOLTECH. And then the other goal is for those of you, there's some people here that aren't SOLTECH employees, but to show you guys what React Native is, what Create React Native app is. Hope I don't have to say that much more. It's a mouthful. Just show you what it is, what it can do, and hopefully just show you how to get started with it. It's very simple. I know I've talked to a lot of people who are interested in React Native, and they just haven't taken the leap yet. And so my goal is hopefully you will watch this and realize it's really not that big of a leap at all, and you'll get started and start using it and building stuff in it. So that's kind of my goals for this talk. Hopefully I achieve those. So I meant to post this in the Slack earlier, but if you guys would, if someone would, I mean, nobody does, that's okay. But if you could download this app, Expo, it's going to be, it'll come into play later during the interactive segment of this talk. But yeah, hopefully we'll have some fun with that, and I'll kind of show you what it is. So just kind of a brief overview. I'm going to kind of give you guys a little bit of a story, take you into how React came to be, so that we can kind of understand where we're at now, right? So I'll talk about React just a little bit. Then I'm going to talk about React Native, what it is, and then from there I'm going to talk about Expo, which is an SDK that you'll know all about, hopefully in a second. And then Create React Native app. And then I'm just going to briefly touch on how we're already using React Native and Expo and all that here at SOLTECH. And then along the way, I'm going to be kind of showing you guys some React Native code and just kind of talking about a little bit, just super briefly, some of the differences you can expect when you're coming from a React state of mind on the web to a native application. So, first off, the story starts with a guy named Mark Zuckerberg, right? The story might be a little dramatized for the sake of this presentation. But he came up with this great idea, or rather he really, borrowed it. He stole it, right? He stole this idea. Don't worry, the Winklevoss twins are doing great, by the way. They're Bitcoin billionaires, so it worked out for them too. So he had a great idea. He's like, I want to make a website where I can check and see if women are single or whatever, that kind of thing, right? So he was like, it's going to be great. He was super excited about it. I don't know if you guys seen the video or the movie, but he's writing algorithms on the wall and all that stuff, right? So he's pumped. So he gets started. And then it turns out that making websites is actually kind of hard, right? Especially when you got a lot of stuff going on. You got a lot of users, you got comments, you got people's, status as far as they're single or not. You got all this stuff that's updating, right? And so, Mark finds out that it's kind of hard to make these websites, right? So what's he do? He decides he's going to make React. He didn't actually make it. Let's just pretend. So what is React? React is a framework I'm pretty sure everyone's at least heard of here in the room. If you haven't, check it out. It's a library for building user interfaces with JavaScript. That's the key here. It's pretty popular. Like I said, we all kind of probably have heard about it. Open source, all that good stuff. So really the key here is how it works on a very basic level is you've got these web components that you're looking at. And right here is kind of the virtual DOM, right? That's kind of the key behind the whole thing. So the idea of that is it's a representation of the DOM in your memory, which you're checking against the actual browser's rendered DOM. And when there are changes, you only update what's changed, right? So there's this level of abstraction here. And that's going to be kind of important when we get into React Native. So keep that in mind, right? So he makes React, he makes this website, Facebook. It's a huge hit. People love it, right? But now Mark has a whole new set of issues, right? He realizes, this is like 2005 or 6 or 7, I don't know, whatever. He realizes that people love Facebook so much they want to be on it all the time, right? And he's noticed that there are people that are on their like Nokia phones or whatever, and they're like looking at Facebook through the browser and their phone, and it's just not a great experience, right? So now Mark's got a whole new set of issues. Like he wants to make a native app, right? That's his idea. That's how he's going to fix this. So he is like, I'm going to figure out how to make some native apps, and he realizes that there's iPhones now, there's Android phones, there's even Windows phones. Have y'all heard of that? What? Yeah, it's crazy, right? So he's like, well, how can I make these native apps? He finds out he's going to have to download Android Studio. He's going to have to probably hire people that know Java to program these apps, right? He's going to have to probably have a whole nother team, too, that knows, at the time, Objective-C or Swift or whatever. And he's going to have these people building pretty much the same app, and there are going to be 2 different teams to do that and maintain it all, right? And here's the problem is that back then, you know, he goes to the accounting department, which is probably some guy at a frat house, and he's like, this is what we got to do. And the guy's like, we don't have any money. We don't have ads in Facebook yet. We can't pay for that. So Mark's like, I've got another idea. What if we take React, which we've already built, right? And we've already got that abstraction layer for the virtual DOM. What if we use that as a bridge in this context and render our components through that and just decide on the fly kind of what those components will be based on the end platform. So what React Native is, that's what we got to do, React Native. What it is it's a framework for building native apps with JavaScript. And you know, the key here is that it will actually run natively on iOS and Android using the React library and do that through this bridge here. And what's also interesting to note too is because this level here is kind of that abstracted virtual DOM bridge. What's really cool is you can actually write for any platform that will run JavaScript engine. You just have to write the connector for that platform. So, for example, I believe, I'm actually not sure if Windows Phone supports React Native yet or not, but I know that Windows has announced, very exciting, that they will be supporting this. But the cool thing is, like I said, you can write it for any platform that will run JavaScript as long as you build that bridge, which is totally beyond me, but whatever, right? So, what are some of the pros of using React Native? Well, the big key takeaway is that now instead of having well, there's a lot of good things about it. For one, now instead of having 2 teams that are working on an iOS build and an Android build, you can actually write all of your JavaScript and all that and have that be compiled down to work on iOS or Android with your one JavaScript code base, right? It's written all in JavaScript, which is really cool for the people at Facebook and also the people here, if you think about it. So what this means is, we can have people that are experienced with the web, and they can be moved over to create applications on the native device, right? So that's super useful. You don't have to look for somebody that knows Java or somebody that knows Objective-C or Swift or anything like that. So that's a big pro with it. Like I said, it's been widely adopted already. There's a large community for it. It's open source. I will say, and I do want to mention here that I've actually only been using React Native for the past few months since I've been here at SOLTECH. And I will say that it is rapidly being iterated on. For example, when I started, we were on React Native 0.48. Now it's already on 0.51, and that was, like I said, only a few months ago. So that comes with it, the kind of the growing pains. It's going to be updated a lot, but there is a large community. There's a lot of resources out there that help you out if you get stuck. And like I said, now with React Native, you can reuse a lot of your JavaScript in your web views and your native views, which is pretty cool. But there are still some cons with React Native, right? So there's some differences with a lot of the features that you normally would access on a phone that you want to. And with React Native, that's still, you kind of still have to write your own implementations for those. So Niall brought up a good point, and kind of one of his use cases was he was trying to use the audio, and it turned out that the audio implementation for the two platforms through React Native was different, right? So he had some troubles with that. And I will say you can also write your native implementations of those things, but then you have to manage the different builds, right? You still need Android Studio or Xcode to compile those builds out, to test them, put them on your devices, and so that's kind of annoying. And then, like I said, I kind of touched on it earlier, but there's some common APIs that are pretty common, but they're not really easily supported between the two, right? So React Native isn't perfect, right? But then came along Expo, which, I mean, still not perfect. But what Expo is, and this is where it gets a little confusing, but it's essentially an SDK that's built on top of React Native. And the real key takeaway, the really cool thing about Expo is that it makes getting your app on your phone almost instantaneous, right? They've really focused a lot on making it accessible to you and getting you up and running, especially with the debugging and all that stuff, right? The cool thing is you don't need Xcode anymore. You don't need Android Studio or any of that stuff to build your code. You can now do it all through Expo, which is pretty awesome. And I'll show you that a little bit more in a second. Not only that, but it also adds a lot of commonly used APIs that essentially what it does is it takes both implementations and it kind of finds like the lowest common denominator and implements it that way. So you can just use the Expo API to do things like showing the map views, messing with audio, and accessing vibration and all that stuff. And it makes it easy, and so that you really only have to maintain that one JavaScript code base, even when you go to build. And then, so that's where Create React Native App comes in. Okay, so all of that is it's a CLI tool. If you guys are familiar with Create React App or Angular CLI or something like that, it's the same kind of deal. And I'll show you it in action in a second. Essentially, all it does is it's going to scaffold up your project. It's got Expo included within it, so you'll be ready to roll almost instantly. And like I said, with that integration of Expo, it really just kind of allows you to get going and get started, start testing, start building stuff. So before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and actually build a project really quick. Hope it works. This is the technical part where it could get a little dicey. So we're going to make, just for the sake of this demonstration, we're going to make an app. And we're going to call it the Naughty List. Because the holidays are coming up and you probably want to keep track of people that are on your naughty list, right? So I'm going to start at building. That's all you have to do. And I'll go over, so to get started, all you really need is Node.js installed on your development machine. Probably good to have an iPhone or an Android or something like that to run it on. It's probably useful to have the Expo XDE, they call it. I'm not sure what that means, but it's just kind of that user interface that you saw where you can actually build out the Expo stuff. However, I will say this. I got pretty far without even installing that, so it's not necessarily a requirement until you really get into like the publishing stuff and all that. You'll need the Expo Mobile App, and what this app does is it's kind of a way to bypass having to build it and actually deploying it straight on your phone. And I'll show you kind of how that works in a second. It's pretty cool. There's a lot of cool things about it in that, say you want to, and I might have a slide on this later, so maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but say you actually want to test it, have some users test it without having to go through test flight or without having to submit it to the iTunes store and go through all that stuff, right? Well, through the app, it kind of bypasses the need to install things through those Google Play stores and all that. And it makes it super easy. It's really cool. And then on iOS, I did have to install, not iOS, well, whatever. I'm not really a Mac guy. I just pretend while I'm here at work. But I had to install these packages. I don't know if those are common or not, but don't worry if you forget. It's going to yell at you. So you all know the drill. You want to get started? Use the package manager of your choice, yarn or npm. Just globally install it. And then what you'll do is you'll run that command, which I did a second ago. And then just go get a coffee or something, because it does take about 30 seconds. So when that command runs, it's going to build out a project for you, and it's going to look like this, right? So you've got kind of the standard stuff going on. There's a little bit of a few extra things if you're used to looking at pre-React app that it makes for you. But you don't really have to get too involved with that. I mean, the great thing is it sets all this configuration stuff up for you. And then you're probably like, what's this? I don't know what that is. Well, I'll show you in a second. Anyway, looking at that's kind of boring. So let's see what this actually made, right? So we ran the app. It has already made it for us. I'm going to go ahead and run it and hope that it works. So what you'll see is what it's going to do for you, and this is all the Expo stuff happening, right? It's going to give you a QR code, and there's some other options too you can look at. Now, if you downloaded this app earlier, what you can do right now with your phone, how the hell this works, is scan the QR code, and then essentially what this does is it starts a development server on your computer, and you can see here it's going to start bundling up that JavaScript code. When it's done with that, it will send it to your device directly. And you know what, to be honest, I've never tried it with multiple people doing it at the same time.
We're going to break your machine.
Who knows, it might blow up. Let's hope not.
I don't know if I can get that close to it.
It scanned from here. I was pretty surprised, yeah.
Yeah, it's like really cool. It's you can like scan a tiny little bit of it and it'll work.
Oh, you know what? You might have to scroll up because you only got part of the code now.
Oh yeah. So as we can see, we've got it running on my Pixel, Bruce's phone,
It's just
Taylor's iPhone.
Oh, cool.
Can you drop it down?
Awesome.
Right there.
Very cool.
So yeah, there you go.
The shake feature is pretty great.
Oh yeah, that's another thing too. So when it's in development mode, you can shape your phone, and it's going to give you some options where you can reload the app, you can hard reload it. You can do things like show the performance monitor. You can do hot reloading, which I think is actually already enabled by default. And I do want to go ahead and show you all that. So
Isn't that great? Hold on, it's going to be cool in just a second.
So as you guys saw, I mean, it was almost no time or effort to get it already running on your phone natively. And so another thing I'll say too is, and we'll get into this in a little bit, right? But what's happening is it's connected through the Wi-Fi in the building, and that's actually probably a good point. People that aren't connected to the Wi-Fi, I'm not sure if that would have worked for y'all. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys some of the hot reloading features, right? So this is the naughty list, so we got to make this right. And don't worry, in a second I'm going to kind of step through like what you're seeing that's the same, but also what you're seeing that's a little bit different as far as how it relates to React and React Native. Magic.
Pretty good.
It's crazy.
Just give me 1 second. Just make this like really big. Okay, now I've saved that. Hopefully, it should
Whoa.
Yeah, it did it.
update on your phone.
That's all right.
And you know, I didn't really have to do anything.
Reload it real quick.
Yeah. So it is. I mean, it's not perfect, but as you can see, I mean, you just save it, and it's gonna just update on your phone as you're working on it. So it's really kind of easy to get started and start working with it. That's one of the cool things about Expo. And then, like I said, you can always shake it and do some other stuff. There's even an inspector here. I probably should have got a screenshot of this because it's hard to see on your phone, but it'll kind of show you like your elements that you have on the page, your components and all that. And it'll show you like kind of the CSS-ish type things. So it's pretty cool, right? I think so. Okay. Where were we? Okay. So, let's take a step back for a second here. And I just kind of want to talk about what you're looking at that's different. If you're not familiar with React, this might all be different to you a little bit. But if you are familiar with React for web, there are some differences here, and a lot of that is mostly because instead of rendering on a DOM or a browser, you're rendering on native app stuff, right? So if you think back to that diagram that showed the bridge and then how it connects all that. So for example, you know, let's just go back and show that. It's going to take me a second. Okay, so you know, just looking at this component here, well, this says it's a div. You wouldn't really use that. You'd use a view or something, right? So what's going to happen is it says hello, right? When it goes to this bridge, if the platform is iOS, you know, that view might render out as a UI view, right? Which is a native component that the iOS can understand and display. Now, if it's Android, you know, since it's a hello div, it might be a text view, right? So it'll make that decision and render it out as that, right? And a thing I do want to note is the performance is really good on this. I think that probably if you were to like do some performance tests really hardcore, React Native would probably be a little bit slower, but I think for 99% of the use cases, the end user is never going to know that it's made in React Native or anything like that. So I think that as far as that goes, the benefits of being able to write it in JavaScript and maintain just that one code base is really kind of outweighs the performance hits. I mean, it depends on your app, of course, right? But whatever. So now let's step through this a little bit. One of the major differences you'll see is you've got this React Native stuff coming in, right? So that's what you see here, right? So there's no divs and there's no p tags and there's no H1 stuff that you're used to with the browser. Instead, you've got things like a view, which is essentially a div. You've got text, which is, a span, like a span element, so like a p tag or H1 tag or whatever. You've got other things like list view and image, right? So there's a little bit of growing pain getting used to these new elements that you're using, but other than that, I mean, you can see it very clearly looks like just normal React. And then you've got the style sheet down here. I'll get to that in a second. So some of the benefits that you get that you wouldn't necessarily have on a browser or in the web is you have access to all these pre-built components that Mark has let us use, right? So like I said, I'm not going to go through all of them because there's a lot here, but I did highlight some of the ones that I've used quite a bit in our development here. Image scroll view, that's just a thing that's going to scroll when you swipe it. Also, these are all on the documentation sites, so don't worry about remembering everything. But these are a lot of the common components. And then here are some of the all of the APIs that you have access to with just React Native, right? So I didn't highlight anything here. I guess I didn't think anything was interesting. But you do have like an alert, which is pretty cool. It's what you're used to seeing on your iPhone when like you click something that says, "Are you sure you want to do that?" It looks just like that. It's super easy to implement. I mean, it's pretty much alert.alert. You pass in an object that has all the info in it, and it just works. It's really cool. You could actually probably put one in the naughty list out in a second. Anyway, so there's all that API, and then something that you'll notice is, and this kind of shows you what I was talking about earlier with Expo, and how that adds yet another layer of APIs that they've kind of standardized that you can use if you're using Expo, right? So I found some things interesting here, and I've highlighted them. Like if you want to access this accelerometer, if you want to do the pedometer, if you want to do push notifications, Expo has a whole thing that will kind of handle that for you. I haven't implemented it yet, but I'm going to be soon. But it has a whole thing on how to do that. There's a map view. I've used the font because apparently these things load fonts in differently. But with Expo, it's kind of all taken care of there for you. So I just want to kind of start briefly talking again about some of the minor differences. One of the biggest ones, I think, for somebody coming from the browser world straight to this is that you can't really use CSS anymore, right? Because it doesn't exist on these native things. But what React Native has in it is kind of a light subset of CSS, and it's handled a little bit differently, right? So it actually uses JavaScript objects. You can see that things are named almost always the same. It uses camel case instead of kebab case because they're object keys, so that works out a lot better. But you kind of set it up the same way. And there are some things that get a little bit weird about this, but there's also some really cool things about this. My favorite is I like to use Sass when I'm just doing web stuff and CSS. And my favorite part about Sass is mostly just having those global variables, or those variables you can pull in, and you can make a change to the variable, and then everything with that class or that variable updates, right? Well, you can do the same thing here, and a lot of times with my React Native projects, I've got just a file that's just a list of variables, and I can pull those in, import it into the top level of my component, and then just pull those in and use them wherever I want to. So that's pretty cool to me. Sorry, I'm just really excited. One thing to note that's quite a bit different, well, not quite a bit different, but a lot of times React Native is kind of built to use the Flexbox more, right? So that's how the layouts are kind of designed to be most of the time, because you've got, it's just a little bit different than a browser, and it just kind of works out better that way. So if you're not familiar with Flexbox, I would suggest make sure you read up on that some before you start trying to style your components. It will definitely help you out. You'll notice here there's like a style sheet thing. You don't really have to worry about that too much, but essentially it takes care of some performance things for you. Something about it can refer to things by IDs. It's pretty cool. So I know what you guys are all probably like thinking right now. Like, okay, I can see that this would be pretty cool to start and work with, and you can get started pretty quickly, right? But what happens when I want to actually deploy my app, right? When I finished it, I feel good about it, I'm going to put it out there. Well, there's a lot of different options for that, or there's a few different options rather. The first thing you saw was it running locally on the network, and now to touch on that again, that's just getting served the files from my computer here, right? So if I were to close my computer, or if you were to go downstairs and go home and you tried to open the app back up, it wouldn't work, right? So that can kind of be a problem. But what you can do is, and this kind of requires you to create an Expo account, but that's free to do and set up. This is pretty cool. What you can do is you can host your app through the Expo server itself, and they'll host it for you. And the way that that kind of works is you go to a link, it essentially will send you the JavaScript package, and then you can run it. So if you guys want to, you can download this little app here. Just take a picture of it with that QR code again. It's a really good looking app that I made. But I just kind of wanted to illustrate how easy it is to share what you've made with people. Now, once again, this is running through the Expo app, but like for some of our cases here at SOLTECH, I've been able to give this link to Ray to QA and test it, and I can just send him that link, right? And he can just download it to his phone through Expo, and it just works, right? I don't have to like make an IPA or APK out for him, and then he doesn't have to like plug his phone in and drag it over and all that stuff, right? So that's pretty cool. And also, if you wanted to beta test stuff, you don't have to go through the test flight or anything like that. You can just send people this link, say, hey, download this Expo app, and they'll want to download the app, just do it, right? And then you can get your testers to just start working with it. But finally, you're probably like, well, this is all well and good, but if I wanted to like put this out there, right? I don't want people to download this Expo app and all that. Well, you can actually have Expo generate IPAs and APKs for you. So what it will do, and I'll be honest, I haven't really done this yet, but I did read the documentation. Trust me. You can use a command line tool. You send them like what you want an APK, and it will compile it and send you back a link, right? Which you can download, and then you can submit that link to the App Store or to the Android Google Play Store. I mean, there are cases where I do want to mention that this is sort of like Create React app, where you can eject from this whole ecosystem. Once you do that, you will lose access to some of this stuff. You'll have to make your own builds, which means, again, you'll have to download Xcode, have that running, or Android Studio, right? That's kind of a pain, but it is possible, right? So if your app needs like a super specific native implementation of something, that option is still there. You're not like stuck in this per se. So yeah, that's how you can deploy through it. Let's see what else is on this deck. So all that being said, I do want to take a moment to talk about how we're already using it here at SOLTECH. I kind of hope that throughout this presentation you've seen some of the benefits and the use cases for it, but already what we're doing is we have, and I can't talk too much about the details of this application because we have non-SOLTECH people here, right? NDA. But we have right now an application that we are building for a client that enables communication between two different kind of users, one that's on a web client and one that's on a mobile app, right? So the way that I've organized it is I've got my project for the mobile app, right? Which is, again, it is a single JavaScript project, right, that works on both iOS and Android. You will notice, I mean, so I've been saying this, it is pretty seamless, right? When you build it out on the two different platforms, it works pretty well. There are a few things with the styling where, like, for example, Android doesn't support like top border without having like all the borders, or there's just a few little things that I've noticed through going through it. So it's not like completely perfect, but generally there's some solutions. Generally you can find something that will work relatively easily. But like I said, I've got my mobile project, right? And that's all the UI, right? That's all the implementation and all that. And then I have the web client, right? So one thing I do want to note is that because we're not rendering out, because you're either rendering to a browser or to a native device, you still need to have your web UI separate, right? Which is a bit of a hassle. But the cool thing is, because it's all JavaScript and all that, it's relatively easy to set up your project so that all of your business logic and all of your API calls and all of your, like, if you're using a Redux, all your state management, you can put that in another project and then import that into your UI projects, right? And so the really cool thing about that for me so far has been, say I need to make a feature on the web, right? So I built the feature, the state management that deals with the feature, all that stuff. And then, you know, when I next sprint, I have to implement the feature in the mobile side. A lot of the hard work's already done for me. I just have to pull it in and hook it up to that that third project. Right? I will say there is a little bit of setup that you have to do to set this up like this, because I don't know if you've ever tried to work with Create React App or Create React Native App, but it has some limitation. Well, it just doesn't. It has a certain way that it wants you to do things. So, like, for example, this project here, the utility one that I'm pulling in, needs to be packaged as like an npm local module and all this stuff with that. So there's a little bit of setup, but like I said, I think it is definitely worthwhile. And it's kind of made my life a lot easier just using Expo and all that. So that's how we're using it here. I should have had a summary slide, right? But to summarize, React Native and Create React Native App, which is really hard to say, is pretty cool because it kind of eliminates that need to have, well, for us here at SOLTECH, right? An interface engineer can jump on a mobile project if they need to and start working and just get. I mean, there's a little bit of learning curve, but it's way different than like saying, oh, I need to learn Java, or oh, we need to hire someone that knows Java to make these mobile apps. You know, instead we can have an IE just start working on it, and they'll feel relatively comfortable. So that's that. Does anyone have any questions? Sure.
Two questions. First, to reiterate what you said, so you have to build a mobile view,
Right.
and then also a desktop view, basically.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. So those views are totally different.
Right.
So you utilize the same libraries or packages or whatever.
Correct. Yeah.
And last question: so is Expo free? How do you generate the APKs? At what point does you have to pay for something, or how does that work?
So yeah, that's a good question. Expo is free, like the app to download is free. On your phone it's free, the XDE is also free.
Right now.
Right now, that's how they get you, man.
That's how they do it.
That's how they do it. I don't know, it says it's open source. I don't know if there is plans in the future to monetize it. I'm sure there are. But right now it's all free to do for now. So it's pretty cool.
You mentioned that there's some stylistic differences in like Android and iOS, but how does it jive with OS updates? And if iPhone comes out with a new update, are all your apps going to be rendered useless, or should they update with it as well?
So the way that that kind of works, and I've only kind of delved into this a little bit, but it actually runs off of mostly that Expo SDK, which, and this is kind of a cool thing too, but as long as that SDK isn't changed, it should work, right? I mean, I think there's going to probably be some instances that will break it, like probably. I haven't used it enough to know yet, but something that's cool to bring that up is that because of that, and because it's JavaScript and all that, you can actually update your app, and users don't necessarily have to download a new update for that app, right? You can do take advantage of over-the-air updates, which is pretty cool. The way it kind of works is it has a cached version of your app, and then when you go to open the app, it'll check to see if there's a new one. And for Android, it'll download that new one in the background and still give you access to the older one. And then the next time you open it up, it'll be that new one. For iOS, I guess it's synchronous, so it'll actually download the new one. So yeah, it's a good question. I don't have exactly an answer, but I think it relies heavily on the Expo stuff, so to kind of help that stay working.
Well, and it'd be the same situation that anybody else would be in, right? I mean, if you go to build your app against one target version of Android, and then they update, that new version would, it may not run on that new version, but then with Expo, what they'll do is they'll end up, when you end up compiling it, and then it's that compiler that needs to get updated. So you're kind of relying on like the Expo community to get it updated, and it's all open source, so they're keeping up with that and updating things.
And another thing I'll mention too is, and I actually almost had a slide for this, but then realized it's kind of boring looking. But there is like all these configuration JSON files that you can configure your app through Expo, right? So you can tell it to target a certain Android SDK. Another thing that's really cool is you can do things like set the orientation of it, right? So that's something that came up with our project. It was like, well, what happens when you rotate? Should it rotate, or should it just stay in portrait mode, right? And you can set all that through the Expo build configuration stuff. And it's just a JSON file, like very similar to your package.json. Yes.
Two questions.
Yes.
First, I think it's quick. Do you use CSS to do the styling, like colors and positioning of like the UI elements? You still use that?
So for the positioning, a lot of that is kind of handled through the Flexbox. So a lot of the properties are the same. I think that's kind of the core of your question, right?
Yeah, yes.
There's a little bit different, right? So I think in CSS, like if you see background color, you can just say red. In this, you have to do background color, and then you have to put it in quotes, red. Right? So there's a little bit of differences, but most of the CSS properties exist. You can position things absolutely, and actually move them around. It gets a little hairy with like all the different components and stuff. So generally speaking, it's kind of best practices to rely on the Flexbox if you can, because it'll just decide like how big it should be based on the other components.
What was, like going from doing just web stuff to then trying to do React Native, what was kind of the sort of, you had to get over as a web developer to get into it, to understand.
So yeah, just from it's almost a little bit hard thing for me to answer because, I'm relatively new here. I only started a few months ago. I'd actually only used React kind of briefly, just even on the web side of things. So the whole React thing was kind of relatively new to me in general. But I think that the biggest, I will say that kind of the biggest hurdle is actually like still kind of debugging, right? There's some tools you can use, but you don't have the web browser where you can, I showed you have that inspector, right? But it's not quite as in depth. You can't do some of the stuff you can do with like the Google development tools exactly. So I would say that that's a little bit tough. And also just to note, because I didn't mention this and I wanted to, if you have some console logs, the cool thing with Expo is if we go back to the presentation actually. Oh, jeez. So your logs actually show up here, right? So you can still see like your console log, you can log out objects and stuff. It's just not quite as like, I mean, it's essentially just a window. And like I said, you know, if you use this without the XDE, all your logs are going to just show up in your terminal where you launched it, right? So that's kind of probably the hardest thing. I mean, I'll be honest, it's been really cool just flipping between the two projects because, I mean, you know, you just have to remember like, oh, I should use a view here instead of a div, but I mean, it really, and that's also why like I didn't cover like the nitty gritty of React today because, I mean, well, I know Niall did a lunch and learn for React, but I mean, it really feels very much the same, you know.
So what was your experience? Because like when I did it, the hardest thing that I found was, so are you running it on an Android device or an iPhone?
So I've got a Pixel, right? So I run it here, and that's a good thing to mention as well. Oh, go ahead with the rest of your.
Well, so like the challenge that I had was positioning, right? Like I had to account for the notification bar showing up or not, and like I had to, like there's some things with mobile development that are going to be different,
right?
You know,
yeah.
so there were a few little like, it's like, oh yeah, of course I have to account for the notification bar, like, and I don't have to do that with the browser, you know. So there's a few things that I had. So have you run into any of that?
For me, it hasn't been a huge deal yet. I can definitely see that happening. And now with the new iPhone X or 10, you've got that little divot, right?
But show us this. This is
cool. So this is, you actually do need Xcode installed for this, right? But what you can do is you can hook up to Expo, you can hook up your different simulators, right? So you can run Android simulators, you can run iOS simulators, right? So this essentially is just running that app that we made in an iPhone. I mean, the app doesn't really do much, so it's kind of hard to show. But you can see how it's going to look. And a lot of times in my development, just the practice that I've been in, is I'll be working on it with the iOS simulator, and I'll be kind of doing most of my stuff, right? And then every like hour or so, or every feature I finish, I'll actually go ahead and scan that QR code on the Pixel, and then see it running natively, and see if there's any like Android issues that are coming up or anything like that. I'll show you this too. You can even change like your different phones, right? So you can see that, and I might actually have to restart the whole thing, but yeah, I don't think it's going to run. But you can see that, you know, now it's on an iPhone X. You got that nice thing to account for, right? So yeah, I think the biggest issue could potentially be, and so far the phones that we're targeting are all relatively similar aspect ratios. Now if you go back and you're trying to target like an iPhone 4 or 5 that has a different aspect ratio, it's probably going to be a little bit of a struggle to get that to work with the bigger sized elements. So, but you still can like, and that's kind of I think the reason why Flexbox is used so much is that, you know, it changes depending on the real estate you have. You can still directly set sizes for things, but it can get bad when you go down to like an iPhone 4 or 5. So yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions or anything? Yeah, Matt?
Yeah, so I know like with the web, it's, you know, we always talk about like backwards compatibility with IE or something like that.
Right.
Have you ran it, like, do you guys are actually trying to target specific Android versions or iOS versions, or do you just stick with like the latest one? Have there been any like issues that you ran into with like things working differently on like an older version of Android?
So to answer that question right now, our project is kind of still relatively in an early phase, so we haven't run into those issues yet. I'm sure that they'll probably exist. Like I said, there are ways you can specifically target your builds to do, so we can test those things. But then, kind of like Niall had mentioned, you're going to run into that issue no matter what. If you're just doing a totally native Xcode project, right? You're probably going to run into stuff. So I haven't run into issues yet, but I think that there's potential for those. For sure. Yes.
Do you have experience with other cross-platform frameworks like Cordova?
I don't have any experience with any other ones. I've heard some things about stuff like Xamarin and all that. I don't know if have you used some of that?
I mean, we've used Xamarin here, and Xamarin has some of the same challenges as if you were just to go native, because you have to find a C# developer, they have to understand how Xamarin works. There's a huge learning curve to get started, and then there's just some quirks about how it works on different platforms. With React Native, it's a little bit different because, as he mentioned, it's like if you know JavaScript and CSS, you can just jump right in, and you kind of have to learn, the way React works or something like that, but it's a lot more familiar. So from that aspect, and then for something like Cordova, I think Cordova is probably limited as, there are going to be some limitations because essentially you're just running, a website on your phone. So there's just going to be some limitations. I think you probably have access to certain features of the phone, like the camera or something like that. But then if you want to do something a little more complex, that's when you. And then the styling is going to be a little bit different with this. I don't know if y'all picked it up on it, but there were like iOS elements that were still part of React Native, but they were iOS specific elements, or they were so like the vibration iOS, and so there's some things that will make it so that it's you can make it look a little more native and work a little more native than you would with Cordova, which is going to be very generic.
Yeah. Do they have a way for you to check to see what device it's being viewed on? Is there something built in for that?
Yeah, I believe so. I haven't messed with that, but I've come across just seeing that stuff.
And I think that's what they're using in Expo, right? Because like what all Expo's doing is just going, hey, if you're on an Android, use this thing, and if you're on iOS, use that one.
Yeah. So I think you can definitely access that because, for example, I can see cases where you might want to use an iOS thing on your iOS device, and I've seen people talking about that. So I haven't actually done it myself, but I do know that you can figure out what device someone is on, and so you can still do some of those like native things if you really want to. You just have to have those cases where it checks what platform you're on and gives you the right component. One thing I'll say too is, going back to kind of the sharing code thing, in theory you could share a lot of your, I don't know if you'd ever have a use case for this, but you could share a lot of your container components, right, your React components, as long as they're not, really rendering any like divs or anything like that. As long as you just have those children, you could probably even use those in both places.
They have the extension on your components. You can render components with like .iOS or .android. And when you render the component, it'll go to the right one depending on the platform the phone's already on.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
I have one more question. How does React Native fit into your development cycle? Like one big problem with native mobile app is you have to maintain the Android code base and the iOS code base. But then you mentioned you do need to split your React Native code bases to use. Is that something where you still need to essentially manage two code bases?
Yeah, so for us, that was kind of the when we picked React Native, we were kind of hoping that we could just use React for everything as far as just one code base. But because you're still rendering those views differently, you still need to have it separated. And like I said, you can do some stuff where you share all your Redux and you share all your business logic. You just kind of have to have that in mind from the beginning. Let's see, I'm going to say something else. Well, for us too, the thing about our project that kind of is almost okay for that is that our users on the phone are going to be different kind of users than the people on the desktop. So it almost, honestly, it's almost like we probably would have had to make all new views anyway. They just, even if we could share everything, we'd still probably have to make new views. It's just, And I feel like you're going to come across that a lot. I mean, when you're at a desktop, you've got so much real estate to work with. And then when you're on a phone, you know, you definitely kind of want to, I mean, it's totally up to you, but you definitely kind of want to tailor it to really look good on a phone like this, you know? But yeah, so that's a good question. Yeah.
Is it like desktop and phone, but you never mentioned tablet?
What's that?
You never mentioned tablet, so is there like, I know native Android, you can create different view files, resolutions, that'll the same kind of thing here. How does that do like Rust?
So we haven't done that yet.
They're just big phones.
Yeah, what does Flexbox work?
It would, but I think even in that situation, like if you go from like a 4K monitor to like, you know, something that's just, you know, has a lower resolution, like you'll end up using media tags and stuff like that. And I wonder if there are media tags and if they've got some.
use media queries at all?
Yeah.
That's what I was
So-
actually gonna ask next.
I haven't
Solve
had
that
to.
problem. Right.
I think you can find it.
It's kind of why it's forcing you to Flexbox layouts too.
Well, I'm pretty much done. As soon as these people stop asking questions. No, so yeah, I haven't had to specifically deal with it. But I have, like, you know, as I've been just reading posts and stuff, there are different ways you can stream in different assets and stuff based on the different, I think they do it based on the DPI of the screen. I haven't had to do that yet, but I've seen people talking about that. But yeah, kind of like Thomas was saying, that's a lot of the reason why they kind of want you to use Flexbox. So that is something I do want to look into. What?
Said less.
Anyone else? Any final questions? I think people want to eat pizza. I know I do.
Good job, Duncan.